Welcome to the Ishbel Well Deep Dive Workshop Series, where we dig into complex gut and hormonal conditions through the lens of curated nutrition protocols that draw on the latest science. I'll share client stories on how gut, hormone, blood chemistry, and genetics testing can revolutionize your understanding of a quote-unquote healthy diet. You can heal your body's unique symptoms and in turn up-level your life. The first step on that journey is education. So let's dig in to today's topic. Right, good evening everyone. So tonight I'm gonna present on food sensitivities, which is a topic that I find is quite misunderstood, actually. And so let's first talk about what kind of symptoms can be partially as the result of food sensitivities. And a lot of these symptoms are not gut related, which is frequently what really throws people off, and that they don't see the correlation between food sensitivities and, say, migraines, or food sensitivities and hormonal imbalances. A lot of times people relate food sensitivities to, bloating. So for instance, people will oftentimes eat beans as an example, and they'll get gas. Okay. A lot of times that's actually not a food sensitivity. It's more considered a food intolerance, and that your body is not producing the enzymes that it needs in order to break that down. Okay. Other symptoms that can be linked to food sensitivities would be skin issues. That's a really common one. And then certainly digestive issues of all kinds can be linked to food sensitivities. But frequently what I'm looking at in my practice are some of the symptoms that you might not often link with food sensitivities. So what is a food sensitivity? Essentially, a food sensitivity is where the body has identified that it doesn't like a certain food that you are eating, or in some cases, you may not eat this food hardly ever, if at all. Okay. And a lot of the times, the questions that I get in my practice about food sensitivity is testing. Is, what's the point? Why should I even do that? And, I even talked to somebody today who said to me, I did a food sensitivity test and it was not very helpful. It didn't really change my symptoms at all. And this is a point of pretty considerable confusion for most people, and which is why I wanted to do this workshop on this tonight. So first and foremost, what's really important for you to know about food sensitivities and food sensitivity testing is that you never want to do food sensitivity testing just on its own. Okay, it's completely unhelpful to do it without also simultaneously addressing gut health at the same time. So a lot of times what I have seen happen for clients in my practice is that they just got a food sensitivity test done, and then they pulled all those foods out indefinitely and didn't ever eat those foods again. And that's not what a food sensitivity test is actually for. So I'm going to talk you through the whole process of how to use a food sensitivity test correctly so that you can get the most information from it as much as possible, and get hopefully some resolution to symptoms that may be related to the food sensitivities that you have. So the food sensitivity test that I use in my practice is called an MRT, which stands for Mediator Release Test. And the reason that I love this test so much is because it is very accurate. So it's about 94% accurate, which, if you do your research on food sensitivity tests, that's incredibly accurate test for what is on the market. I do want to point out that people are still doing skin prick tests to identify food issues. And I just really want to highlight this as being a very, very inaccurate way for identifying the body's reactivity to foods. And a skin prick test is helpful for identifying IgE food reactions, but not for any other kind of immune reaction. So you're probably asking, what in the heck is an IgE reaction? So that's anaphylactic. So frequently people who have an IgE reaction to a food, they don't need a test to tell them that they are having an anaphylactic reaction to a food. They know that really well, and they don't eat those foods anymore. Okay. So the kind of testing that we are looking for, and that's actually the most helpful, are for those food sensitivities that may not be as obvious. And so that's where something like the MRT test becomes so helpful for really looking at those nuances. The MRT tests 176 foods, and then it's very actionable. So it categorizes the foods into 3 different sections. There are green foods, which are considered mildly reactive. There are yellow foods, which are moderately reactive, and then red foods, which are highly reactive. And what I do in my practice is I combine that MRT test with a GI map. GI map test is something that I've talked about so frequently on my live workshops. It's really a fundamental and foundational part of all of the work that I do with all of my clients. So the GI map essentially gives us a full map layout of the gut microbiome. It's an incredible test. And so what I do is I combine the GI map test with an MRT food sensitivity test. And the timing of those 2 tests is really important. So you don't want to, again, run a food sensitivity test by itself. Why is that? Because food sensitivities change very quickly. Probably every 3 to 4 months, your body is changing its reactivity to food. Now, certain foods people do remain really sensitive to over time. Okay. And there are some standout ones that don't change. But for the most part, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a snapshot of those food sensitivities, and then we're combining that test with really like the heart of the process, which is the GI map. Now, that food sensitivity test is incredibly important to the gut healing process. Okay. And let me give you a couple of examples of why. So, we have embarked on this journey of identifying the imbalances in your gut. We've laid out a plan for correcting those imbalances on your gut, but we haven't run the food sensitivity test. Okay. Let's imagine that onions, for example, are incredibly problematic for you, but you eat them every single day. So you actually have no idea that onions are causing the gas and bloating that you are experiencing every single day. We could, of course, assume that the inflammatory species that we identified on your GI map was the source of your gas and bloating. But say it's not. Say it's actually the onions that you have been eating every single day and you have no idea are a problem for you. Okay. So by combining that food sensitivity test with the GI map, we're kind of covering all of our bases. So the yellow foods, which are the moderately reactive foods, we pull those out of the diet for 3 months. Usually most people have about 10 or so foods that are yellow foods. We pull those foods out at the same time that we're going after the imbalances that we've discovered on the GI map. And then the red foods, which are the highly, highly reactive foods, we pull those out for 6 months. Now, usually for most people, they only have 2, maybe 3 highly reactive foods. Some people don't have any. But the deal with those red foods is they can be a little bit more difficult to reintroduce because the body is really mad about them. So after we are done with the gut healing process, we then reintroduce those yellow foods and you introduce them one at a time. And that's really important. And you eat a pretty significant amount of that food that we had pulled out for the 3 months prior. And the reason that the reintroduction process has to be super organized is because it can get very confusing. Okay. And I see this so frequently in my practice where, a client has identified that, like, I don't know, eggplant is a huge problem. And so they don't eat eggplant anymore. Okay. But then they're like, gosh, I'm still having some of those issues. I think maybe it was the corn that I've been eating. So then they pull corn out. What this ends up turning into is that their diet becomes incredibly limited because they keep trying to figure out what food is causing them the issue. And they keep pulling more and more things out, and their diet becomes very constrained, and it ends up not being healthy because there is not very much dynamic value to it anymore. So by running this MRT test, we're able to accurately identify the foods that are really problematic, pull those out of the diet, and then help to support the gut in its healing process. Then once that healing journey has been completed, we bring those foods in one at a time. And again, really eating a pretty significant amount of them in one day, and then waiting for actually 3 days to see if any symptoms have emerged during that process. So if migraines were a huge issue for you, we would really be on the lookout for migraines as you reintroduce one food at a time. And you might be surprised to hear that this has happened many times in my practice where we pull out a certain food and then we reintroduce it after that 3-month process of gut healing. And lo and behold, that client gets a migraine again when they haven't had one in 3 months. Okay, so that is a really clear and defined way to identify those foods that the immune system has really identified as being a significant issue. Okay. The problems that this food sensitivity test solve for us is, again, it really helps to cut through the confusion. So if you have been trying to, figure out where your symptoms have been coming from and you keep pulling foods out thinking it's this or that, that is a frustrating experience. I have done that before and it's not fun. So to just get black and white test data makes a huge difference with that. And then again, number 2 reason to always bring a food sensitivity test in simultaneously with your gut healing process is so that you're simultaneously addressing the imbalances in your gut and offloading your immune system of the food sensitivities that you may have. Okay. And then at the end of that gut healing process, you can reintroduce those foods and then really get a good sense of what foods are actually problematic for you. And for the majority of my clients, they usually reintroduce about 85 to 90% of the foods that we've pulled out. Okay. But those few foods that remain are really truly problematic. And so we work together to keep them out of the diet for a longer period of time. Okay. So if you are struggling with gut issues, hormone imbalances, migraines, skin issues, that's such a big one with these food sensitivities. If you're not getting traction on some of these symptoms and you've done gut healing before, but you never actually did the food sensitivity testing, it really could be a very valuable piece to add to your gut healing process. But again, being sure that you always combine a food sensitivity test with a stool test, never doing them just by themselves. And then also keeping in mind that just because a food shows up on a food sensitivity test, it's not for forever. Okay? You got to try to reintroduce those foods after you've done your gut healing. Okay. And a lot of times people don't do that. They just pull those foods out forever. And that is not what that test is really intended for. All right. All right, y'all. Have a great night. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me for the Ishbel Well live workshop series. If you have questions about this workshop or you have an idea for an upcoming workshop, please get in touch with the Ishbel Well team. You can email us at info@ishbelwell.com. That's info, I-N-F-O, at ishbelwell, ishbelwell.com. We would be absolutely thrilled to hear from you. And if you are not yet on the Ishbel Well newsletter, hop on in there and you will get the recording every single time one of these workshops is completed.